Congress barrels toward another deadline to fund the federal government, with a potential shutdown now looming at midnight on Tuesday. If that happens, it would be the fourth federal shutdown in a dozen years, leaving the senator joining us today to conclude that surely there's got to be a better way.
From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome, I'm Kyle Peterson with the Wall Street Journal. We're pleased to have here with us today Senator Ron Johnson on location from the great state of Wisconsin. And Senator, unless you have some big news to break, neither of us knows if Uncle Sam is going to be open for business 5 days from today. But what's your perspective on the state of play as we sit here on Friday afternoon? The House has passed a bill to extend current funding until shortly before Thanksgiving. Is there much hope of getting to the 60 Senate votes needed to get that through the upper chamber?
Well, Kyle, let me just start with a question. Aren't you getting sick and tired of this? This is my 15th year. I am beyond sick and tired of this. The current state of play is Chuck Schumer, Hakeem Jeffries, their opening negotiating stance is, we'll give you a 4-week CR. In other words, we'll fund the government for another month. And all we're asking in exchange is just a mere $1.5 trillion of additional spending over 10 years. That's it. Entirely reasonable. What the House has done is they passed a relatively clean continuing resolution till right before Thanksgiving. I'm not particularly nuts about that. I mean, that's the same old playbook. No matter who's in charge, neither side can get the 60 votes, in the Senate because we don't have the supermajorities. And so what ends up happening is the uniparty, the big spenders, have just set up this process of creating these fiscal cliffs. Nobody is particularly serious about passing appropriation bills in the first 9 months of the year. So we passed none. We passed a couple, through the Senate. I'm not sure what the House did. I'm not sure they passed any. But so everybody knows we're not going to fund government before the end of the fiscal year. So now you get into the new fiscal year. You haven't funded it. And so you set up these fiscal cliffs right before Thanksgiving, right before Christmas. And what that does is it creates an enormous amount of pressure to just pass something and get out of town, which generally results in a lot more spending than we ordinarily would. Okay, so I got here in 2011. Since that time, we've had 3 government shutdowns. We've had 55 continuing resolutions. I couldn't even tell. I don't think I can count the number of actual appropriation bills individual that we passed. Way less than 55. We've had 12 increases or suspension of the debt ceiling. We've gone from $14 trillion in debt to over $37 trillion in debt. Clearly something is broken. It's time to change this dynamic, which is why in 2019, as chairman of the Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs Committee, I just tasked my committee, said, we're going to pass some kind of automatic continuing resolution. So like the state of Wisconsin, we did this back in the 50s. If you're so dysfunctional, you can't fund the government, you don't shut it down, you just continue funding it at last year's levels until you get your act together and pass an appropriation bill, right? So the same basic dynamic. So we had 3 different alternatives. I think Rand Paul had a continuing resolution that actually reduced spending. I'd love that. Rob Portman actually would have increased spending. James Lankford and Maggie Hassan did what Wisconsin did, just continue at last year's level. The problem with their bill is it also set up a lot of pressure to just get the thing done, probably would increase spending. So that was a legitimate complaint about that bill. Even though I supported it, I passed it. So what I've done is I've skinnied that way down. And now it's just a very simple bill. It's called Eliminate Shutdown Act. And all it does is it establishes rolling 14-day continuing appropriations if you haven't passed an appropriation for all of government or individual departments. So what that does is, let's say we just pass that bill and we haven't passed any appropriation. If the Senate House passes an appropriation, let's say for Veterans Affairs, okay, that continuing resolution would end because now we have an appropriation bill, and you've got 11 other departments you have to appropriate. A couple weeks later, pass another one. A couple weeks, you could actually take the time and pass them individually, find the areas of agreement. If you simply can't find areas of agreement, again, you don't shut those departments down. You just continue spending at last year's levels. Now, that creates enough pressure in big spending Washington. Everybody, seems like everybody, or not everybody, because there are a few people like me, but everybody seems to want to increase spending. So you're going to have the pressure to do those appropriations bills, but you give yourself time without playing games with people's lives. And that's what's so grotesque about this is, again, this is very predictable. I mean, this isn't my first rodeo. I see exactly how they're doing it. Again, I'm not that nuts about the House passing a continuing resolution that just happens to expire right before Thanksgiving holiday. My guess is if that's what happens, we won't come to terms there. They'll pass another continuing resolution that will expire right before Christmas. Again, like I say, this isn't my first rodeo. So I want to end all that drama. I really do think this may be the perfect time to pass something like this, because who could be opposed to it? I mean, literally, who could be opposed to doing something so reasonable? Just keep spending, give yourself time, spend at last year's levels, get your act together, end the dysfunction.
And part of what's important for listeners to understand is that a government shutdown does not even often save any money, because the furloughed workers are guaranteed back pay, is my understanding.
Oh, yeah, they get vacation, they go to spas, and then they come back in and we pay them back pay. That's exactly what happens. No, it's a ripoff of the American taxpayer. It's costly. It's why I generally have already voted for a continuing resolution as long as they're short enough. Yeah, I don't like it. It's not a good way to fund government. This is a far better way. Just automatic continuing resolutions, rolling 14 days at a time, and then start knocking off these appropriation bills one at a time. Again, nobody can predict exactly how it all work out, but what it could do too is take the partisanship away from the funding. In terms of the shutdowns, maybe we would pay some serious attention to real budgetary and appropriation reform. For example, an idea that's been kicking around for years. It's not this isn't original with me, but go to 2-year appropriation bills. So you've got 12 accounts, right? So if you do 2 years, you can do 6 1 year, do oversight on the other 6, and then reverse the next year. I could go to 3-year appropriation bills. You only have to pass 4 at a time. Again, that kind of impinges on a new Congress. If you do, there are complications, but again, you could start those conversations. You could start bringing some measure of function and rationality back to this appropriation process, which is clearly completely broken and spending is completely out of control.
Yeah, and the shutdown, if it happens, despite not saving any money, may really inconvenience some people. I mean, some of the effects depend on who is deemed essential employees who still have to show up for work even if they're not getting paychecks, and what activities are deemed non-essential. So, for example, on Capitol Hill, the Capitol Police are expected to still be operating, but there won't be any garbage pickup. There won't be any Capitol tours. And if this is your family's one trip to take your kids to Washington, D.C., to the nation's capital, tough luck. And so I think part of the argument here is that this is no way to run a railroad, to use that old expression. So what is the response that you're getting from your colleagues about this idea to just have a flat continuing resolution automatically for the accounts that these 12 appropriation bills that Congress is supposed to pass every year, for whichever of those bills that are still waiting to get through?
Well, let me first point out that the government thinks a lot of itself, right? So most of government is deemed essential, and most will continue. I mean, we shut down less. We shut down less than 10% of the federal government, and of course, under Democrat presence, they make those shutdowns as painful as possible because the media is always going to blame Republicans on this. But the good news this time is it'll be managed by a Republican president. The presidents have a fair amount of discretion to reapportion, move money around, make a shutdown as painless as possible. That's what would happen in this case. So that would be the good news out of this. But again, the Preventing Government Shutdown Act that we passed out of my committee, that was a bipartisan bill with Maggie Hassan and James Langford. It had a number of Democrat senators supporting that. So there's nothing partisan about my proposal here. A continuing resolution, from my standpoint, will still spend too much, but it's a whole lot better than what you described, shutting down government, furloughing people, giving them back pay once they come back, so you don't even get the fruits of their labor while we're shut down. It disrupts it. It drives up costs. Again, it's just incredibly stupid. It's completely dysfunctional. It's grotesque. And again, it's such a simple solution. It's just keep doing these rolling CRs and then get to work and start funding these agencies the right way.
What do you make of the argument that Congress in this polarized and partisan age needs these kinds of hard deadlines coming up to bridge the divide, even sometimes within the Republican Party on things like the SALT deduction, where there are disagreements within Republicans? I mean, maybe part of your response is that by keeping the continuing funding flat, it won't take away all the pressure to get the appropriations bills eventually passed, because I guess the argument is that if you have a step up slowly over time, then maybe the End Shutdowns Act would be the new normal, and Congress would be content to just let that funding continue.
It wouldn't be the worst outcome, but again, there's enough problems with just continuing resolution. You can't fund new defense programs. I mean, it creates pain on both sides, which will bring people to the table. So again, there's really not a good argument against doing this. The only argument for doing it is it really plays into the hands of big spenders. And let me just describe this. So generally what's happened, you have these shutdowns, you create these cliffs, and we get a 2,000-page plus omnibus spending bill dropped on our desks on December 23rd. Nobody has a chance to read them. And what's happening in this process over the years, over the decades, I mean, this is lather, rinse, and repeat, right? This happens over and over again. Well, they tuck all kinds of nasty stuff in these omnibus spending bills. And here's the nastiest. Again, these funding fights are only over about 25% of the budget. So this year we'll spend about $7 trillion. 25% of that is about 1.8. That's what we're fighting over. The other 5.2 is mandatory spending. But here's the important point. Of the 5.2, $1 trillion is what they refer to as other mandatory. It's not Social Security, it's not Medicare, it's not even Medicaid. What it is what used to be discretionary spending that in some way, shape, or form, and I think a lot of this probably occurred in these omnibus spending bills, somebody wrote in that, now this spending, we're going to transfer this into the mandatory category, so we never pay attention to it. So that can go out of control. So now that's $1 trillion. So we spend 1.8 trillion discretionary, but we've transferred about $1 trillion of what should have been 2.8 trillion in discretionary. So we could sit there and say, look, we're not increasing spending that much because we're only talking about the discretionary accounts. Again, it's a despicable game. It's been played by both sides. It's been played by the uniparty. It's what I kept screaming about in the one big beautiful bill, that we had literally hundreds of billions of dollars of other mandatory spending, again, not Social Security, Medicare, or even Medicaid, that we've increased far beyond 2019 spending plus up for inflation and population. It's about $234 billion higher than if you had just taken the $642 billion in 2009 other mandatory and grow it. We're spending $1 trillion, $234 billion more than he just plus that up for inflation and population. So again, I know that's kind of getting in the weeds, but that's how the uniparty does it. They make it so complex. Again, they set up these fiscal cliffs, omnibus spending bills, multi-thousand-page bills. Nobody reads, they get passed, and we move on, and we mortgage our children's future. That's what's happening.
What is your read of the politics of these shutdowns and the history of them, how they have played over the years? I mean, it does seem in some sense that there's maybe a reversal of the roles here. I mean, people probably remember the 2013, I think, shutdown it was, where some Republicans were making the argument that if we stick together, we can get a spending bill passed and President Obama will sign it and we can defund Obamacare. And it's kind of flipped here now. Remember, Democrats are in the minority in the House, in the minority in the Senate. They don't hold the White House. And part of what they are holding out for here, that $1.5 trillion figure that you cited, is a reversal of some of the healthcare changes that were in the one big beautiful bill, and then also an extension of some of the Obamacare health plan subsidies that were passed during the COVID pandemic. And so, I mean, I assume that Republicans are not eager to undo some of what they just passed in the one big beautiful bill. But does that suggest that part of the political dynamic is that Republicans can make the case that Chuck Schumer and Democrats are courting this shutdown and make that in the public on the public airwaves?
Well, first of all, understand how incredibly unfair these shutdown fights are. You know, Republicans like me, if there's any threat of a shutdown, if we're withholding our vote, it's because we're trying to stop mortgaging our children's future. We're trying to reduce the growth in spending. There's really no talk in actually reducing spending. We're just trying to reduce the growth in spending. The problem is, American public, they love free money from the federal government. And of course, we don't educate. We don't have our news media talking and connecting the dots. Well, this massive deficit spending, which, by the way, current estimate is we're going to average over the next 10 years $2.6 trillion per year in deficits. Now, those ramp up from about the $2 trillion this year up to over $3 trillion. But imagine that, $26.4 trillion deficits over the next 4 years. That's the current estimate. So again, the few fiscal conservatives in Washington, D.C., we dig our heels in. We're doing something that's not particularly popular because the American public loves getting that free money from the federal government, and they don't connect the dots that, well, that's why your dollar is devalued. And Kyle, let me just tell you to the extent it has. In 1998, a dollar you held in 1998 is only worth 51 cents. A dollar you held in 2014 under Obama is worth 74 cents. A dollar you held in 1980 is worth 80 cents. That's why you can't afford things. That is what I call the chronic debt crisis. It's just been building up over decades. What we're trying to do is we're trying to avoid an acute debt crisis where we have a failure of the bond markets.
Right.
And you saw what happened with the Great Recession when we just one money market broke the buck, and we had contagion in the Great Recession. So we're trying to avoid that. We're not doing a very good job of doing so.
I mean, you say we're digging your heels in, but Republicans are in the majority here. And so if we get a shutdown next week, do you think that Republicans can successfully make the argument to voters that the shutdown is because Democrats, who don't control either chamber of Congress, are holding out for more than is reasonable?
I think so. Again, on Monday night when we return, we'll bring back up the House bill, which the Democrats voted against as we left town. So we'll bring the House bill back up, just a clean CR. Again, I'm not that nuts about that. I don't like the way they're playing games with continuing it right before Thanksgiving shutdown. That builds pressure to spend more than we should spend. But then right after that, we're going to be voting on the Eliminate Shutdowns Act. And so again, Democrats vote against a continuing resolution. Say, well, let's avoid a shutdown. Okay, then let's just avoid that, and then we start working on these appropriation bills. If they vote no on that, who's trying to shut down the government? So I think we can do that. Plus, as I said, previous shutdowns have generally been managed by Democrats who try and make it as painful as possible. The shutdown under Trump, very few people even knew it. Again, Democrats make sure you shut down Yellowstone National Park. They make it very visible, very painful. President Trump and Rush Vogt, they will manage this thing as painlessly as possible. And, Kim Straus had a great piece in today's Wall Street Journal talking about how Rush Vogt will be a very powerful man, and he will use this shutdown to do what Trump and Republicans want to do is we'll start trimming government. If that's what Democrats want, I mean, Kim makes a very strong point that it'd be really stupid of Schumer and Hakeem Jeffries to actually do this, but it looks like they're headed down that path.
I also wanted to ask you about another topic that's been in the news, a push on both sides of the Capitol to ban members of Congress from trading stocks. You recently voted against a bill on that in committee and went so far as to call that proposal legislative demagoguery. What's informing your opposition to that idea?
Well, first of all, just so you know what I did when I became a U.S. Senator, I sold all my marketable securities. I didn't even put them into an ETF. I just sat on cash, and I lost my you-know-what sitting on cash. I mean, since that time, I've invested in some ETFs. So again, I think that's just a good practice for members of Congress. But, we passed the Stock Act. We have very, very complete disclosure of, what our financial situation is. Now, again, I think the way we disclose it with these enormous limits, an asset between $5 and $25 million, you don't get it.
Right.
I don't know why we do that. Within $100,000, this is what you have in that particular assets. So there's reforms you can do that, so you can really hone in on what somebody's net worth is. But we fully disclose any transaction over $1,000.
Right.
And if you're a Republican, trust me, the legacy media, the liberal media, they watch that like a hawk. So if there is any concern of a conflict of interest or inside trading, that should be very, very well publicized. I mean, we've got this one former congresswoman running for a governorship who made apparently $6 million. She sat on the Arms Appropriation Committee and, buying stock in these companies that might get some of these contracts. I mean, that looks like conflict of interest, but that's being reported in the media. And the voters can take care of that. So this is a completely unnecessary piece of legislation. It was grotesquely overreaching. Again, I suppose I could vote for, don't vote for trading individual stocks, put those things into ETFs or some kind of stock index fund. But this would have forced, like, a business person to divest of their long-term business. It impacted family members as well. I mean, it was just such an overreach. Plus, the sponsor of the bill, Josh Hawley, didn't provide us the up-to-date copy of the bill until the moment of the markup. He apparently had provided the Democrats that, so they were all in lockstep in terms of what the bill has. We had a red line version. Nobody could even figure it out, but it was just a grotesque overreach. And what I also said is that you could have renamed this the Career Politician Protection Act. I come from the private sector. If I would have had to sell my business the minute I became a U.S. Senator, there is no way I ever would have run. Now, a lot of people may wish that would have happened, but we want more people that have private sector experience, that have built businesses, understood how onerous taxation and the regulatory burden is on a business, and come to Washington with first of all, the experience in, which means the knowledge of, and maybe even more important, the sympathy for somebody in the private sector trying to grow a business, trying to create jobs. We don't have enough people like that in Washington, D.C., obviously. We have way too many career politicians. So again, it was this legislative demagoguery. I think the sponsor was saying, well, the American people just don't trust members of Congress. Well, it's because you're telling them that they can't trust members of Congress. Now, there's certainly some members of Congress I wouldn't trust. But again, it's like Nancy Pelosi. How does she make those riches? By the way, in committee, an amendment by Rick Scott to do an investigation of how Nancy Pelosi became too rich, that was voted down by Josh Hawley and the Democrat co-sponsors of the bill. So go figure. So they didn't really want to go into specific members of Congress. They just wanted to paint a broad picture, basically indict every sitting member of Congress like we're all corrupt, we're all involved in insider trading. And I'll make a final point. I've been here 15 years. I don't serve on the armed services, so I wouldn't know about those contracts, but there's not one time, not one secure briefing, not one piece of information that I've received that the public didn't know about that I went, ooh, this is a good opportunity to make some money in this stock pick. Not once. So this is blown way out of proportion. And again, we need to get more people from the private sector. This would be it's already a huge deterrent. Giving up your private sector life and coming to serve in government. I don't want to create greater deterrences because I want more people with that private sector background, citizen legislators as opposed to career politicians.
Just to underline a couple of those points, since I tend to agree with you, that Stock Act that you mentioned does prohibit members of Congress from trading on non-public information. And sometimes that is investigated, but I can't tell you how many of these stories that I read that promise a scandal in the headlines, so-and-so member of Congress traded X, and you get down halfway through the news story, and then it says that the congressperson in question says, oh yeah, I mean, all that stuff is done by my husband without my knowledge, or some outside financial advisor. Or even sometimes in some of these stories during this COVID trading was people saying it's all in a blind trust. I mean, I don't even know what's in there. And so, I mean, I agree with you that this is blown out of proportion. But for some of the people, particularly on the left, deterring successful business people from running for office seems to be part of the point. There's another bill circulating in the House, and one of the sponsors is Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. She said at a recent news conference, if anyone says, this isn't fair, I'm going to have to divest all my stocks if I'm going to run for Congress, maybe you should stay home. She went on to say that millionaires are very overrepresented and there are a little too many here. But I agree with you, Senator, that my concern would be that already there are plenty of reasons for people to decide if they're thinking about running for public office. I don't really want to do that. I want to put my family through that. I don't want to go through the public scrutiny of that, and a big financial hit. And for business people who built up a portfolio, or for spouses who have built up a portfolio. If somebody's thinking about running for office and maybe her husband is a professional investor, I just worry that that's one more disincentive adding to the pile. And by the way, as you point out, all this stuff is disclosed. So if somebody is day trading in office, whether or not they're doing it on insider information or not, voters can take account of that. And I'm sure these people, the senators and congressmen, get asked about their trades.
Well, if you're a Republican, you certainly are. Now, we've known about Harry Reid going from, kind of a pauper to, multimillionaire. Same with Nancy Pelosi, her husband, an unbelievably successful investor. Their constituents kept reelecting him. They knew full well. So again, it's in the end, the voters is the control. It's about disclosures, and the media for sure is going to be bird dogging Republicans, conservatives. They'll look the other way generally with Democrats. It's again, it's not a level playing field. But again, this was an overreach. I think it's even would have impacted what your children could own. I mean, it was a grotesque overreach. And again, legislative demagoguery is what it truly was.
Thank you, Senator Johnson. Thank you all for listening. You can email us at pwpodcast@wsj.com. If you like the show, please hit that subscribe button, and we'll be back next week with another edition of Potomac Watch.